You are listening to the Fresh Take Network.
What it is, what it do, we're going to Fresh Take Joshua Adam William Arbuthnot with the talented, sexy, dangerous, the Devoneer. Roar! It's Devon Seal.
I think it's more of a growl.
More of a growl, like a roar.
Roar. Roar.
And with Mr. Andy Kenyar.
Hello.
So Andy and I did this a while back with the Raptors, where we looked back at the Raptors. We really went their whole run. This is going to be a little bit shorter, kind of going back to the Vancouver Grizzlies. And they were here, and then they weren't. I guess before I kind of go to a round table of starting the expansion, then going kind of through these redrafts of everything, just kind of want to get some early thoughts early on of the Grizzlies coming into existence. I'll start with you, Andy, since you're the older of us and probably have a little bit more. I was 10 when they came around. I think Dev was, what, 5?
I saw Grizzlies game live.
How old were you when the Grizzlies came, Dev? 5?
Oh, yeah, something like that, yeah.
95.
Yeah, something like that. Oh, yeah, it would have been like 5 or 6.
Yeah, and I was 10. And Andy, you're much older. Well, not much older, but older enough to remember things. So you kind of remember the actual like formation of the expansion into Canada and all that. So kind of elaborate on that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was an exciting time here. I mean, we live in Alberta. And so, as you know, the Raptors were great, but the Grizzlies were close, right? So, I mean, I actually we went to Vancouver when I was playing basketball at the University of Calgary, and saw Mike and the Bulls play during the 72-win season against the Grizz, and it was fun. I mean, it was the team that was close to us, so it was the team that I guess it was a little bit easier to get involved in. But you know, it was obviously a bit of a short-lived process for some reason, which is I find very odd, because when I was going through the university process, there was a ton of really good basketball players coming out of BC. Almost more so than it was coming out of Ontario at the time. And so you would have thought that being in Vancouver, it would have been just sort of immersed in this hotbed of basketball in general. UBC, UVic, St. FX, Simon Fraser, were all great basketball schools. So you would have expected it to be better, but I think as we go through here, we see that there was definitely some player issues that came up during the Grizzlies run that probably limited their future in Canada.
So a little bit of a trivia note here. When we did the Raptors, obviously, they had a bunch of names, the Spiders, the Tarantulas, the Towers, that were all kind of pitched, and they had a fan vote. So, come with the Raptors, obviously Jurassic Park was high. Do either one of you know the tentative name that the Grizzlies were going to be called originally? There's 3 names were pitched, but there was one specifically that they were going to be up until the last second. And then fans objected to that, and they changed to the Grizzlies name. But outside of the Grizzlies, there's 2 names that were passed around. One specifically that was pitched until fans, went against it.
The Orcas? Were they the Orcas?
No, they were the Orcas.
Okay. That feels very Vancouver-y.
Well, I think like the owner owned, like the owner of the Grizzlies was the owner of Orca Bay Sports Group or something like that. Right. So that would have been pretty on the ball. No, wasn't it something more kitschy? Like it was way more Canadian and like kind of.
It's definitely Canadian. It's definitely.
It was like
Canadian.
the Mountie. It was like the Mounties or something, wasn't it?
Bing, bing, boom, boom.
Yeah.
Ooh, good call.
Yeah, it was the Mounties and they go to a fan vote, which I can't find some of the other names. So originally it was going to be the Mounties, and that was the name they came in with. And the fans objected to it so much, then much like with Toronto, they ended up having a fan vote, and it came down to 2 names, Grizzlies and blank. Do you know what the other name was?
What year is this?
This is 95. It's not really based off a movie or anything like that. I don't really know if said animal, person, creature is really specific with Vancouver or not. I think there is one other sports franchise that was named after this, but not at the time. They weren't named after this.
Oh, that's kind of general. Something to do with salmon, maybe?
Not salmon, no.
I hear some clicking in the background. I think someone's trying to look it up around our backs.
No, I'm not that devious. I've admitted my defeat. Orcas was my best guess.
So the other one that lost out, do you give up, Dev?
Yeah, I give up.
It was Ravens, the Vancouver Ravens.
It makes no sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's not Canadian or Vancouver-y or anything.
they go with Grizzlies. I would say, just as a kid growing up in Canada, Raptors kind of had the edge early because Jurassic Park was cool and the name of Raptors was cool and the purple really stood out. The Grizzlies had really nice uniforms, though. I don't think that was deniable. But the Raptors kind of had the appeal early on with the big dinosaur on the logo and how influential and big Jurassic Park was at the time.
Did you see Bleacher Report last week? They just did a survey of the best jerseys of the 90s, and it was Raptors 1, Grizzlies 2,
Really?
and Sonics. I think the original green Sonics was 3.
Those are pretty dope. So then we go to the expansion.
Oh, no, Charlotte, the Hornets.
Charlotte. Oh, yeah, you got to have those pinstripe ones. Then you go to the expansion draft. So originally, the Grizzlies, they end up with the following players: Greg Anthony, Rodney Dent, Antonio Harvey, Reggie Slater, Trevor Ruffin, Derek Phelps, Larry Stewart, Kenny Gatson, Byron Scott, Gerald Wickens, Benoit Benjamin, Doug Edwards, and Blue Edwards. I would say, as far as name value, compared to the Raptors, they ended up having more name value players, I think is fair to say.
I couldn't name a single one of those people, so...
Because the Raptors had B.J. Armstrong, Tony Massenberg, Andres Gilbert, Keith Jennings, D'Antonio Wingfield, Doug Smith, Jerome Kersey, Zan Tabak, Willie Anderson, Ed Pinkney, A.C. Earl, B.G. Tyler, John Sally, Oliver Miller. You know who obviously Byron Scott is, and you know who Greg Anthony is.
So you're saying Toronto had more named players?
Vancouver did.
I think Toronto did.
I would think Toronto had way more name players.
Well, Greg Anthony's more known. Gerald Wilkins, Byron Scott, Benoit Benjamin.
I don't know. John Sally, Jerome Kersey.
Yeah.
I feel like the peak of Toronto is not as high as Vancouver's. Like Vancouver's 2 or 3 main guys may have been more known, but I think overall the Raptors had kind of a more of a quality bench.
The Laker fan here is trying to overvalue Byron Scott.
I mean, he's a name. Whether he's a Laker or not, he's a name, period. Here were the players that were available for them to take, and let's not worry about what salary is or whatever. Kind of just go here and we'll each pick 10 players and kind of go back and just whatever.
Before we do that, I have a question. I mean, if they were to do an expansion draft now, do you think that is great, much more better if they were to do something like this now? Like, I feel like the depth in the NBA currently would give you a lot more options of more named type players.
Well, they talked about this when they talked about expanding to Vegas. It would have been an expansion draft, and a few years ago they did mock drafts because I believe the rules is you only can keep 3 players. So you were let's say you're talking to 2 or 3 players, and so you're looking at a team like the Warriors, potentially would have lost Klay Thompson or Draymond Green.
Right.
So they're all it's a pretty established drafting system. I just don't remember how many players it is. So, but part of the problem is if you expand to 31 or 32 teams, advocates would say that the league is already kind of watered down as it is. That it would just be more watered down. You're trying to look at like if you're a business owner, you want to have like one all-star or one um, all-star tier player per team, roughly. And you wouldn't get that with 32 teams at the moment. Like there's probably not 32 like marketable stars in the NBA. There's probably 25 or 20. Even when you look at guys with shoe deals, like with numbered shoes, it's probably, I think it's like 7 to 9 players or something like that. So even less so.
That's a good point. So the expansion list that we have here. So some of these guys, obviously, we're not going to have any idea who they are. Andy might have a better idea, obviously, following the NBA at that time, a little closer than we were. But Atlanta, Doug Edwards and Blair Roseman. Boston, Dominique Wilkins and AC Earl. Charlotte, Kenny Gatson and Robert Parrish. And David Wingate and Michael Adams. Chicago, BJ Armstrong, Corey Blunt, and Ron Harper. Cleveland, John Battle, Danny Ferry, Gerald Wilkins. Dallas, Terry Davis, Donald Hodge, Doug Smith, Roy Tarpley. Denver, Reggie Williams, Dale Ellis, Reggie Slater. Detroit, Oliver Miller. Golden State, Victoria Alexander, Keith Jennings, Dwayne Morton, and Ryan Lothage. Houston, Vernon Maxwell, Zonda Bach. Indiana, Scott Haskins and Byron Scott. Clippers, Randy Woods, Harold Ellis, Tony Massenberg, Elmore Spencer, and Eric Riley. LA Lakers, Antonio Harvey, Sadell Threat. Miami, John Sally. Milwaukee, Ed Pickney. Minnesota, Andre Gilbert. Stacey King. New Jersey, Yinka Dari. Benoit Benjamin. New York, Doug Christie, Herb Williams, Greg Anthony. Orlando, Rodney Dett, Anthony Avnet, Daryl Armstrong, Geert Hamnick. Philadelphia, BJ Tyler. Phoenix, Trevor Ruffin. Portland, Jerome Kersey. Sacramento, Frank Brakowski, Lionel Williams. San Antonio, Willie Anderson. Seattle, Byron Hudson. Byron Houston, Antonio Wingfield, Rich King, Bill Cartwright, Sandreas Milaris. Utah, Blue Edwards. Washington, Kevin Duckworth, Larry Stewart, and Rex Chapman.
Yeah, like I remember during this time and when everybody was coming up with their names, I mean, players like BJ Armstrong weren't the only ones who were saying, if I'm selected, I won't go.
Mm-hmm.
This was a real challenge that the NBA was having with the established players, was so many of these guys were very much out front and very vocal about their lack of desire to go to Canada. So I think, for all the names that you hear, I mean, a lot of guys, the Dominique Wilkins of the world, they were past their value point anyway. But also you had a ton of those guys who were very adamant about, hey, I'm not going. If you choose me, I'm not going to report.
Was Dale Ellis one of those guys? Because that's who I would have taken in a second.
Dale Ellis was one of those guys, yeah.
Yeah, because I still would have taken Dale Ellis and ran with it. I would have taken Ron Harper. See what I could have done. Rex Chapman I would have gone with as well. Daryl Armstrong I would have taken a swing on. There's a few guys that obviously, Herb Williams had some value as well. Danny Ferry. There's a few guys in here you can make a decent roster. Bill Cartwright. There's a few guys you can make decent value of, and the Raptors took one of those guys in Jerome Kersey, but I believe he went there and then he demanded a trade, I believe, right?
Yeah.
So.
And it was very different. I mean, I think back to the expansion in the NHL with Las Vegas Knights, where they, because of how they did the players that were available in the expansion, I mean, they were super smart, right? Like they drafted out of the draft like 9, 10 defensemen, knowing that a bunch of those players were going to be trade bait. So they were able to amass all these second, first, third round picks just because they saw that there was value in these players. Now, that value wasn't to their team, but it allowed them to amalgamate draft picks in their first couple seasons, which is a big part of why they've been successful. So, I mean, obviously it's easier with a larger roster, but it's definitely a different format when you're only allowing 1 or 2 guys, because I think restrictions were in place, like they had to be in the league for X number of years. Like you couldn't draft rookies, you couldn't draft like early players. So there was like a million, which is I think why you see that there's certain teams have 4 or 5 players available, and other teams have 2 or 1.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
in 95, because they added 2 teams, there was an expansion draft, and there are certain rules. I just found this out recently. So there's 27 teams in the NBA at the time. Each team had protected 8 players from the roster. So what had happened between the Raptors and the Grizzlies was there was a coin flip, and the winner of the coin flip got to choose if they wanted the higher draft pick or the higher expansion draft pick. And so what had happened was the Grizzlies and the Raptors each selected 13 or 14 players, which would have been one person from each team.
Right.
Interesting.
So then the Grizzlies won the coin toss and decided to have the higher pick in the 1995 draft, allowing the Raptors to make the first selection in the expansion draft.
Which was B.J. Armstrong, who refused to play there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we moved to that 95 draft now, and like Dev just pointed, the Raptors lost the coin toss, so that gave the Grizzlies the first pick there. That first overall pick was Joe Smith. So we're going to kind of, I guess, go in resurrection type of fact now, I guess. Is that how we're going to do this, Andy? Of kind of looking back at where they could have gotten the pick from, or at the time, who was available on the board, who would have been a better pick?
Let's look at who was available on the board, because I mean, to say, oh well, this player should have gone earlier,
Right.
that is kind of irrelevant. What we want to do is say, hey, kind of like what we did with the Raps draft.
Right.
Is, okay, this is who you did pick, but here's who would have also been available. Right. Yeah.
Okay, so obviously, I'll just kind of run up to that point. The first pick in this draft is Joe Smith, then Antonio McDyess, then Jerry Stackhouse, then Rasheed Wallace, and then Kevin Garnett goes just before the Grizzlies have to take him. Obviously, if the Grizzlies get Garnett, the franchise is a much different place right now. But they take big country Bryant Reeves, who has a soft spot in a lot of Grizzlies fans' heart. But there might be a better pick there. So here are some of the other picks, and I'll let you guys decide. Here are the other picks that are around that had decent to okay NBA careers. So after him is Damon Stoudemire. Then you have Kurt Thomas, Carlos Williamson, Brent Barry, Theo Ratliff, Mike Finley, and that's about it. Fred Hoiberg. And
Corey
then
Alexander, not a bad
Rick Bronson and Kevin Ollie are
Greg Ostertag.
Where?
Greg Ostertag was drafted to 28th.
There you go. I think the pick would be what, though? Michael Finley now?
It has to be him or Ratliff, right? Like,
yeah.
Depending on how you were going to build your team.
I'm not convinced. What didn't Bryant Reeves give the Grizzlies with his time there?
I don't think he didn't give them anything more, but it's clear that Mike Finley's a better player. No, he was fine. I defend Bryant Reeves. I mean, his numbers for a big are not bad. Like, you look at it.
12.5, 7 rebounds, 1 block a game. Like, that's pretty solid for a big guy in the 90s when you're going against, like, friggin' Akeem Olajuwon.
Shaq and everyone, and he shoots a field goal percentage. His field goal percentage isn't great, though. He's shooting 45% from the field for a big that should be a little bit higher. Highest he shot was his best season in 97. He shoots 52% from the field. His free throw percentage is actually really good, though. He shoots 73% overall career from the field.
Because you also have to look at it, too, like, you can't just – like, this pick wasn't made in a vacuum where they didn't have anybody on their team whatsoever, and Bryant Reeves was, like, the focal point. Like, they were already doing the expansion draft, right? So they already had a number of players on the team. They're trying to fill a need.
Yeah, they had a ton of guards, right?
I mean, in hindsight, though, would you not say Michael Finley is the better pick here, though? He's the better player that would go there to take instead of Bryant Reeves?
Sure. He had a longer
I think Devin's
career.
right,
consistent.
Though. I think you're Dev, like, this does come down to how the team was constructed in the draft first, like in the expansion draft, because you look at the guys that they had a bunch of guys at the 2 and the 3 spot, which probably is one of the reasons why someone like Finley maybe didn't look as good.
Well, he's also at the 20s too. Their guards at this time, by the way, are Greg Anthony. Their shooting guards, by the way, are Kozan Martin, Byron Scott, and Gerald Wilkins. Byron Scott's in his 12th year, Gerald Wilkins in his 9th. Their center was Benoit Benjamin at that time, Eric Mobley out of Pitt. Power forwards were Kenny Gatson, Doug Edwards, Blue Edwards.
So what they could have done too was just Yeah, especially in the 90s. What you could have done too is just pick the best player on the board or the best available. And remember that a lot of these guys were coming off of like 3 or 4 year college stretches too. So for all we know, because I wasn't really cognizant back then, Big Country could have had the best college career out of anybody on that list. Like Michael Finley could have been like a guy who was projected to rise but didn't see his potential yet. That's why he was drafted like 21 or 22.
Yeah, we're also doing this within hindsight now of if they did this now with a little bit of hindsight, who could have been there as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because like if that's the case, like Antetokounmpo going like 13th or whatever was a total steal, right? Like
oh yeah,
the
absolutely.
reason why they got it was because they needed like long, skinny guys because that's where the NBA was going. And it just happened to work out that he grew another 6 inches.
So are we staying with Bryant Reeves here? Are we going Stoudemire? Are we going Michael Finley?
You know what? Damon Stoudemire probably had a better career than Reeves.
Yes, he definitely did. Would you take him over Michael Finley though?
Stoudemire? Ooh.
Yeah.
Is Stoudemire's peak better than Finley's peak?
I'd rather have Michael Finley. Michael Finley was an all-star.
Let's take a look at Damon Stoudemire.
Michael Finley, by the way, as you look at Stoudemire,
Finley's best year in Dallas.
Two-time All-Star.
Is that the best
and
version of him?
he was in the All-Rookie first team, by the way, as well that year.
Damon Stoudemire, 878 games, 13 points, 3.5 rebounds, 6 assists.
He's the Rookie of the Year too.
That's not bad. 8 seasons in Portland, 3 in Toronto, 3 in Memphis, 1 in San Antonio.
By the way, Bryant Reeves is on the second team, and so is Kevin Garnett. That first all-rookie team is Damon Stoudemire, Joe Smith, Jerry Stackhouse, McDyess, Sabonis, who's also in this draft, and Michael Finley. I didn't even see Sabonis, so I must have passed on him.
I think he fell like really, really late because of the whole like foot injury and the Soviet thing, and the fact that he was a bajillion years old at that time.
I guess if I was the Grizzlies, I wouldn't take a chance at Sabonis because he is older. You'd want to take a chance on a younger player, so I would still take Bryant Reeves over Sabonis at the time, just because you're a young franchise and you don't want to take a chance on an older center, even though Sabonis
wasn't a chance. Sabonis was a known commodity because of like Olympics and Eurobasket and stuff. Like he was an international star.
Yeah,
it just took forever to come to the NBA, and then when he did,
he was the best player not in the NBA.
Yeah, him and Marcelonis were like the 2 best players of the world, not in the NBA, and then Marcelonis came over.
I don't think Sabonis is part of this draft, though. I think he was part of a prior draft, and then he joined the NBA.
This was just his first year he played.
86 draft. Took him 9 years to get to the NBA.
Well, you have to remember he was also in the USSR for a couple of those years too, right?
For sure.
So he didn't play until he was 30 years old in 1995.
Right.
Which is crazy.
So, yeah, it is. So who are we going with that pick then? Are we going with Stoudemire, Theo Ratliff, or Michael Finley, or are we staying with Big Country? I personally would go with Michael Finley. I think you get a playmaker, you get a flashy player that's going to intrigue the crowd right away. At this time too, it's 96. Obviously, centers are a position that you want to go with, but I think having the hindsight that we do now, Michael Finley would have been the better player at that spot. He's better than Damon Stoudemire, he's better than Ratliff, and he's much better than Bryant Reeves.
But he's like marginally better than Damon Stoudemire. I wouldn't say he's like head and shoulders. I think that's a good pick. I think it's the logical pick. I'm just saying, I don't know if. I don't think we can like definitively be like, oh God, Michael Finley is 3 times better than Damon Stoudemire.
Right. Okay. Well, then who are we going with then? I say Michael Finley.
I think Finley's fine. I think Finley's fine. I'm just saying like he's not a clear cut total better player than Damon Stoudemire.
What are you saying, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think Finley was the better player. I can certainly see, like Dev was saying, like picking Big Country, it was looked at as the staple of how your team was going to be built back then, right? Like you were going to build off of what you thought was an elite or a potentially elite big. He was, I remember him playing in Oklahoma State. He was very, very effective big in college. that did come in with, thinking that this was going to be somebody. I mean, I don't think anybody thought he was going to be David Robinson or Akeem Olajuwon or anybody like that. But, he was going to be somebody who was going to be a cornerstone big franchise. But I mean, in hindsight, obviously, I think everybody's right here that Finley turned out to be the better player, or have the better career.
All right, so we go to 96 then. In the 1996 draft, the Grizzlies have the third pick. They take Sharif Abdul-Rahim, and all respect to Sharif, who was an all-star and was a great player. They won't be taking Sharif Abdul-Rahim here. Hindsight being what it is, I guess you would take Kobe here, right? If Iverson and Marcus Camby are off the board.
If we took Michael Finley, you probably wouldn't.
I guess. So then what? You take Ray Allen, or you take Stephon Marbury then?
Yeah, probably.
Or Peja.
I mean,
Peja or Nash. You take Nash. You would take Nash. You would take Nash.
Vancouver absolutely would take Nash.
Yeah, you would take Nash.
Yeah.
I mean, hindsight being what it is.
It was a weird pick as it was that they didn't take Nash. Like, I remember Nash's run at Santa Clara, and I mean, you could tell that he was a great player. I got to play here in Calgary. He was here for a Team Canada basketball program when I was at University of Calgary, and we got to watch him play. And at that time, we had Richard Bonney here, who we thought was the best player in Canada in CIU. It was pretty clear that Steve Nash was just another level of basketball player.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess, but I mean, realistically too, we're going to give them Nash, but Kobe would be the best player on the board, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, remember, like, Kobe was like the unknown because he was like they were drafting a high school player, right? Like that. Him and Kevin Garnett were the first ones since, who was it? Like there was this long Moses Malone, exactly, right? So there was a whole group of people who didn't really believe in the whole high school player thing.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Kobe's the better player, and it's probably not as close as we like to think it is. But that being said, like the general thought at the time was, why would we pick a high school kid? And that's exactly why Kobe dropped. Because if it was just purely based on skill, Kobe would have been much higher than what he was.
Yeah, I mean,
and
even
not
if you
not just a high school player, but a high school small. Like the perception was that a big coming into the league, because obviously that's where the success had been with guys like Moses Malone, guys like Kevin Garnett. Those guys had come in and had success. So the perception was a big coming into the league could work, but coming in as a guard was very, very untested at that point.
By the way, 96 may have the best undrafted class, by the way. Ben Wallace, Chucky Atkins, Darvin Ham, and Adrian Griffin. One potential Hall of Famer and three guys that were like decent rotation players.
Oh, absolutely. Ben Wallace. The fact that Ben Wallace isn't Hall of Fame already is astounding.
So, I mean, I think even if you redid this draft, Iverson and Kobe are probably going 1 and 2 respectively, and then Nash is falling to the Grizzlies anyways. So
I have
far,
no problem with that.
No. We go to the 1997 draft.
And then what's funny is Nash and Finley would play together anyways, only in Vancouver.
There you go. Right. So far we've kind of built. I mean, you look at where the roster is at that point. Now in 90. This is 96, 97. Before we go there, so. Still no one really great on that team. I mean, they have guys that, became fan favorites like Lee Mayberry or George Lynch, but still no one really to build around. I think having that backcourt of Finley and Nash at this point is a much bigger improvement than Sharif and Bryant Reeves as your two key players.
And the biggest advantage of this, and we'll get to this not in this upcoming draft, but the one after that, is if you have Nash and Finley, you don't even think about taking Steve Francis.
Oh, we won't talk about that asshole just yet. Save it. We'll talk about him in a bit. But in terms of the build, if this is how you started the franchise, that wouldn't even have been an option. That's a bigger point to this draft. So we go to 97. Some guy named Tim Duncan goes first.
That's fine, because that was going to be obvious. That was
he turned out to be a good player, right?
Then Keith Van Horn goes, who was a fine player. Then Chauncey. Then the Grizzlies take Antonio Daniels, who was fine. He was a very solid player in his career. But at this point, in hindsight being what it is, they take Tracy McGrady with the fourth pick.
Mm.
And then you have Steve Nash, Michael Finley, and Tracy McGrady.
Another high school kid, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the other guys. There's no one else really on the board that you would maybe think of. I mean, maybe they put a Tim Thomas there at that point, but you were kind of going the potentials of what could have been for the Grizzlies if they could have done things right, and it would have been the next possible choice would have been Tracy McGrady, right?
Oh,
You
for
would
sure.
think
I mean, future-wise, he head and shoulders has the advantage over the next, like you said, like the Tim Thomases of the world. You listened to the Bill Simmons pod. Did you find it weird that he was like really tough on the idea that Tracy McGrady's real reason that he was so uncomfortable was because he was in Canada? Like they really pitched that narrative both with Vince and with Tracy McGrady, like that was the underlying. I mean, I think we established when we did our Raptors look back that it was a lot more about being mismanaged and poor coaching situations and stuff like that. That was really the issues there. It wasn't the fact that these guys were in Canada.
Well, the dollar was low,
Yeah,
right? They're
was
usually
low.
far from home. They got to cross customs to get in and get out. Like it's kind of a pain in the ass instead of just flying from like Atlanta to Dallas. So I think there's quality of life things. I think it has nothing to do with the city or the food or the clubs or whatever. But you're right, like especially the team management, team organization, especially for the Raptors in those early years was pretty atrocious. But there's also these other factors too, like being so far away from home. Like Canada didn't have the reputation it does now in terms of being a really viable place to live. And if you look at the reviews from All-Star Weekend in Toronto, like really literally the only complaint was that it was fucking cold and everyone had an amazing time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, Toronto's on that list of like the top 5 destinations that you want to go to if you want to go out and party and drink and go out to eat and stuff like that. Like it's right there with Miami, with New York, with LA. You know, those places are typically all bunched together, and Toronto is on that list.
So we move on to the next draft, the 98 draft, and it makes a bungle of what the Grizzlies are doing at that point. You take Antonio McDaniels in that draft, so you have your point guard, and then they go into this draft, and they take Mike Bibby with the second pick overall, when guys like Antoine Jameson, Vince Carter, Dirk, Paul Pierce are all on the board that make more sense, especially maybe Antoine Jameson at that point, would make more sense with what they have. I guess, so in 97, 98, you have Sharif. This is when Bryant Reeves has one of his better seasons. They add a solid vet in Otis Thorpe. That pick will come back and bite them in the ass because why? That pick gets traded in the 03 draft, if you remember that, and that becomes the second overall pick in the 03 draft. That becomes right. Detroit's pick. So that is that's one of the first big mistakes there by them. They add a nice vet and Anthony Peeler at this point as well. George Lynch is there. Bobby Hurley is trying to grasp onto the end of his career and prove that he's not more than just a Duke player and can do some of the NBA. And so we go to this draft. They take Mike Bibby, who it still doesn't make any sense having obviously Antonio Daniels there. You could have put Antonio Daniels to the 2 guard, I suppose, but Michael Olakandi obviously goes first, so really you have free range to go in the 98 draft. You have Rafe LaFrentz, you have Antoine Jameson, Vince Carter, Dirk, Paul Pierce, your boy Bonzi Wells, Dev, your boy Roshan Lesterovich is there as well. Richard Lewis is there, and Brad Miller, who goes undrafted. Also Earl Boykins goes undrafted. Same with Slava Medvedinko, favorite of mine. Who do they go with the second pick here? Is it
I just want to add, as far as looking at what Mike Bibby was. I mean, you have to remember, like Mike Bibby was he is first team All-American.
Oh yeah, I know.
Out of Arizona, like he was an absolute college stud.
Did they win that year? Did Arizona win that year?
Is that the year they won, or did they get? I know they went ways.
I think that's the year that Andre Miller and Utah win. 1998 NCAA championship. The winner of that is Kentucky. They beat the Utes.
Oh, that was That was Paul Pierce's team, wasn't it?
No, he's in Kansas.
Oh, sorry.
I don't think that's Mashburn either. Trying to think who that 98 Kentucky team is. The 98 Kentucky team is 1998 Kentucky Wildcats.
Nazir Muhammad is the only guy who got drafted.
Yeah, they had Nazi, Scott Padgett, Jamal McGlure, or the big names from that one. Scott Padgett was really the star of that team. If anyone really remembers Scott Padgett, he was a great player. Jess Shepard also had a cup of coffee in the NBA. Actually, he never played in the NBA, I don't think. He may have, but yeah, the biggest name that came out of there was Jamal McGlure and Nazi. Nazi for having a long career, and Michael Bradley, a favorite of the Raptors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, yeah, Mike Bibby obviously was great. It's just you had 2 point guards at that point, and there was other talent you could have maybe gone with. They desperately needed a more attacking wing at that point, and you had Vince and Paul Pierce right there. Hindsight being...
But again, you had T-Mac, right? So if you try to avoid the same problem the Raptors had by having McGrady and Vince together, does Jameson or Dirk
I take Dirk.
Paul Pierce?
You're taking Dirk. You don't have a big, so you take Dirk.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you have the Mavericks.
You certainly have the Mavericks. You have Finley, Nash, Tracy, and Dirk.
But that being said, like we have to.
You have all that with T-Mac added in.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, though, and I think Steve Nash has gone on record saying it didn't until he was traded, it didn't click for him.
Right.
So we can't assume that Steve Nash will be the Steve Nash that we know on his first team in the NBA in his first couple of years, because even he himself says that it took him to be traded to Phoenix and to be essentially cast aside by Cuban.
We lost his buddy, right? Losing that closeness with Nowitzki forced him to be, sort of that standalone leader on that Phoenix team.
Even in Dallas, though, he kind of found his rhythm, and he wasn't behind KJ.
Even the first time, too. The first time he got traded as well, right?
Well, he's also behind Kidd and KJ at that point, too. And finally, he has the only person really behind him is Van Exel at that point, who was a better player when they initially get there, or was whenever that was going on for a second, whenever they were both there. But obviously, at that point, Nash surpassed an all-star, and Van Exel finally had the chance. You're looking at a Vancouver team where he gets to go home, and he is the initial ball handler.
Mm-hmm.
But you bring up a good point. All right, so what are we going to say? Are we going to say Dirk, or are we going to say Jameson, or just it's Dirk though, right?
Oh, Dirk's the best player on that list, but
sure.
I mean, from that period of time, like Jameson's looking nice, Carter's looking nice. But yeah, you got to get a big guy, so you're probably picking Dirk.
I think the more logical thing would have probably been Jameson. I mean, yes, Dirk is the better player, but from what they were like at that time, if you were building the team the way we are, I mean, Dirk was very much an unknown, right?
Yeah, we're gonna go Dirk for fun though. But I trust me, I love the Jameson enough. All right, 1999. Who's ready to shit on Steve Francis?
Uh-oh.
Again,
Josh is definitely ready.
It's the third draft in a row though. They go point guard. So I do blame Vancouver a little bit for drafting him there. You had other good players on the board. You could have taken Rip Hamilton. You could have taken Sean Marion. You could have taken Wally Zerbiak. You could have taken Lamar Odom. You could have traded down and got Corey Maggette, who was a really good player at Duke. You could have gone for Ron Artest. Andre Karolinko's in this draft. I do blame Vancouver a little bit, third year in a row, taking a point guard. And this is why Stu Jackson was so piss poor running that Vancouver organization. 3 years in a row, Antonio Daniels, Mike Bibby, and then Steve Francis. They could have avoided this themselves by taking some other really talented players on the board. But Steve Francis is an asshole.
Why? Why don't you go ahead and tell me what happened?
Why what? Why is Steve Francis an asshole?
Yeah, why don't you tell me what happened?
Because he got drafted by the Grizzlies and immediately refused to play. And if anyone's seen the draft interview, he's pretty much crying, right, Andy? He's more or less crying, saying, "I don't want to."
Yeah.
And
it was as if they were sending him to Antarctica. It was like they were sending him to absolute purgatory by having to come to Vancouver. And I mean, God, Vancouver's one of the best places on the planet to live. Like, how is this such a terrible situation for somebody?
Yeah, it was bad.
Well, you gotta pay. Well, think of a kid where's Steve Francis from?
Where is he from? Well, he went to Maryland, and he is from Maryland as well.
Yeah.
From Tacoma Park, Maryland.
Baltimore, basically Steve.
Which last time I checked, Baltimore,
Francis.
DC area gets cold, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Well, not only that, but like if you have to think like some of these guys, so Tacoma Park, Maryland, suburb of Washington, so he's part of the DMZ. Like he's part of a group of individuals who probably never even left home until he was in college. So his view of the world and his view of outside places and he went to college in his home state. So his worldview is exceptionally small.
Junior.
Is exceptionally small, and his idea of worldliness probably doesn't even factor into his mind at this time. Like he doesn't want to go to a new place. He wants to go to established places he's seen on TV, like LA or New York, because he's only ever played in the same 3 gyms his whole life.
And that's a
Why would
solid
he go to a
point.
different country?
Well, you can only imagine the talks with his boys, right? Like
You're going to
everybody
Canada?
pitching to him how horrible a place Canada is. Like they're pitching it as like igloos and polar bears, and I mean the U.S. educational system sometimes has some challenges at the best of times, but you know that at that time that was the perception. I mean that was the reality. I told Josh this story. I make this joke all the time that, but 2 years before this, we were down playing volleyball down in the States. And we happened to go to Disneyland for New Year's, and we were standing in line for the ride. And one of the guys pipes up, he's like, "Hey, Happy New Year! It's New Year's back in Calgary." And somebody standing in the line looked at us and went, "Where's that?" We said, "Canada." She said, "Oh my God, they have New Year's in Canada?"
It makes sense
New
because the
Year's?
Raptors draft strategy for a couple of years was to just draft Europeans because it's easier for Europeans to come over to Canada and just kind of get along with how Canadians live than it would be some of these maybe these inner city American kids. I have no idea, but that was definitely a draft strategy for a little while because these guys they get off the rookie deals and they wouldn't stay.
Mm-hmm. I also, again, I blame a lot of this on Stu Jackson, too. It was a bad situation all around, right? It's a guy that from one place his entire life obviously doesn't want to leave, and, he ends up going down to Houston, which he's obviously fine with. And Steve Francis becomes a great player, one of the better guards of the 2000s, obviously. But it's also a combination of Stu Jackson and just how bad of a GM he was. And then taking 3 point guards in a row, right? Like you made the argument, Andy, for Bibby in '98. Sure, I guess I can excuse that because you can put Antonio Daniels to the 2 guard spot. What was the reasoning to take Steve Francis here when you already had Mike Bibby?
Well, and what's the rationale when somebody is so clearly what situation in any sport when a person is telling you, "I do not want to go there," does that ever work out? Like, it never works out.
Did he let the Grizzlies know beforehand that he did not want to go there?
He was preaching the whole time, "I want no part of going to Canada." Like, it was very much the Eli Manning, Phillip Rivers situation, right? Like when Eli was like, "No, I am not going to San Diego." And at least they were smart and said, "Okay, if you really don't want to come here that badly, we will figure this out so that at least we get a player who doesn't seem to be bipolarly opposed to coming here."
Wasn't this Jalen Rose's argument with? Isn't this Jalen Rose's argument that modern sports or professional sports are just modern day slavery?
Yeah.
That a bunch of 30 million billionaires can pick a bunch of guys and suddenly you have to go to where they live. Like that's right. Like what any other person in any other place gets to choose where they work and live. In this case, for professional athletes, a guy like this, if he was a welder or if he was a college professor, he gets to pick where he wants to live. So he didn't want to go. What's wrong with that? But at the same time, that's not how the rules work for professional sports, unfortunately.
And it should be noted he became the the rookie of the year too. You look at the Raptors up to this point. This is the year of the Raptors. They changed their course. They trade their pick in this draft for Antonio Daniels and Davis, and their trajectory completely changes where they end up going. A nice steady draft before this of getting Damon Stoudemire, didn't work out, traded him for the pieces. Marcus Camby didn't work out, got Oak. Then you got T-Mac and you had Vince. So Raptors doing some smart things at this point. And again, I think a lot of this does come back to Stu Jackson being a really bad GM. Isaiah gets a lot of heat for being a bad GM for the Raptors and wasn't great. But Stu did such a piss poor job here, 3 point guards in a row. Andy, I'll ask you this. Was there any other buzz that who the Grizzlies would take at this pick at this point?
No, it was so stupid. They were so adamant that it was going to be Steve Francis. Like, it was like Steve Francis or bust. And like I said,
what was the talk with Bibby there? Was there talk about moving Bibby or Daniels at that point with having both of them on the roster?
Well, at that point, Daniels was really starting to look like a second tier, like a bench type player off the,
right.
From the guard spot. Like, he was not playing a ton of minutes. You were still having guys like Byron Scott and stuff like that were still more successful in playing in the guard spot over those years with them. So it was really, he was kind of on the way out. And I mean, by how we're talking about drafting, obviously, if you have Steve Nash and you have Michael Finley, Francis is not even an option. But B, you're not sitting there. You've almost saved yourself from this stupid choice. And you're right. I mean, it certainly shows both from the Raptors and the Grizzlies that making a mistake with your first general manager, like the person who's going to be the core architect of your team, is catastrophic. Like, you can put your team 10 years in the hole by not being smart with how you select players in the draft over your first 4 or 5 seasons.
I should add that by the next year's draft in '98, that Antonio was traded to the Spurs, where he picked things up a lot more. And he was traded for Felipe Lopez, who, again, was a guard. Felipe Lopez became a Grizzlies favorite. But, again, you already had Mike Bibby there. Even if you didn't have Antonio Daniels there, you still had Mike Bibby, who was a primary. And it wasn't like either one of these could move themselves to the 2 guard. They were primarily the point guard position. So it was a really bad look for Stu Jackson at that point. And this is really the pick that I think a lot of people look at this pick and how this really shifted what the Grizzlies were. Because they had a player so vehemently not want to go there. And at this point, this is when Stu Jackson really starts receiving a lot of the discredit of not being a good general manager. This is when the Raptors start changing page. And this is kind of this season where everything, if you kind of look at it in a pot, where everything kind of falls apart for the Grizzlies. We look back at, where we have the draft, but, Sharif and Bryant Reeves are fine. You trade Antonio Daniels, Felipe Lopez was a favorite in Vancouver. That's fine. But this season, after this, is really when because it's after this when you start hearing the rumblings after this season, isn't it, Andy?
Well, and just before we get to that, I mean, let's put this into context. So Steve Francis plays there, so this amplifies the stupidity of the management team. Francis plays there the first year, then he gets moved to Houston.
He never played for the Grizzlies. So
he gets moved to Houston, and that brings in Michael Dickerson, Othello Harrington, Antoine Carr, and Brent Price.
Yeah,
so
Dickerson was good, but he got hurt.
But you double down and you bought guards in. The idea was, I think Dickerson and Bibby, they were that Arizona backcourt, so you thought, hey, we could recreate that here. But again, you have more guards than you need, and then your trade of Francis becomes even more guards.
And Michael Dickerson was a very good player when he came to Vancouver, and it looked like, they may have, Francis got the Rookie of the Year, but Michael Dickerson comes in 18 points a game, then 16 points a game the year after, and then he just gets hurt a lot.
Right.
Well, also they moved to Memphis as well. Like, he doesn't play in Memphis at all. But at that last season in Vancouver, he starts getting hurt. But he seemed to be an okay piece that they had at this point. Anyways,
he was better than Bibby as a.
Oh, he was great.
Grizzly.
I love Michael Dickerson. He was fantastic. It's just fortunate he got hurt. So we look now at this draft now. So we're going to say they don't take Steve Francis here at this pick because we don't need them to, because we have Steve Nash. So we don't need Byron Davis either. So where are we going on this pick? Are we going Lamar Odom Are we going Wally Zerbiak? Are we going Richard Sherman? Are we going with Sean Marion, Corey Maggette, Ron Artest, Karolinko?
Josh, you already know how I feel about Wally Zerbiak.
I know you want Wally Z.
First of all, it starts with an S.
Serbia.
SZZ.
Who is the best player on the board here? I know Wally, and it's probably Rip, right? Because you're not taking Barron, right? And I guess Rip is probably better than Barron. If you have Rip, he's going to probably go to your bench and come off your bench.
Oh, he's deadly, though. He's so, I think he's actually fairly underrated.
We could also trade Michael Finley at this point, too.
Baron Davis and, take up Baron Davis and move Michael Finley? Move Michael Finley?
Barron can't play 2. He's a 1. He normally plays just point guard specifically. I mean, I would maybe lean towards an Odom for the fit that they want, but
Sean Marion maybe.
Sean Marion as well. I mean, there's a few good choices on the board for them that they could have gone with. Wally also. I mean, if you were to take Wally, you just put him on the bench and you just have a nice shooter off the bench that can give you an easy 15 points as well.
Somebody who comes in for T-Mac and Dirk.
Yeah.
So I just want to throw it out there. Are we ever going to draft? Are we going to draft anybody who plays defense in this league, or because that's this? I see some holes.
So what you're saying to go with Meta then?
Well, Lamar Odom, I suppose. He was kind of a two-way player, I suppose. But Dirk is not known as being a stalwart of the anchor on defense, especially at a time when being a 7-foot center meant you had to get 3 blocks a game.
Right.
Steve Nash's defense is obviously he did the best with what he could with his limited physical abilities. So
Sean Marion, our choice then. If we're deciding defender, at least he gave you 2-way play.
Exactly, and you give him Sean Marion and T-Mac together on the wings would be, because Sean Marion could be he could be a power forward, right? It'd be small ball for the 90s, but.
And he played that way.
He'd be like your Durant stopper, right, in today's game.
Yeah.
So suddenly you have Dirk, you have T-Mac and Sean Marion on the wings, which is pretty nice. I'm okay with that. You should put that in 2K and see what happens.
I'm going to do that afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I think that's a good call. I mean,
so you're going to go with Sean?
Yeah, I like Sean Marion. I think he gives you that versatility off the bench. Like Dev said, you certainly get a somebody who can come in. Somebody's rolling on the other team. It gives you a stopper for pretty much all the wing positions.
Okay, well, let's go to the Matrix then. Man, we're really just getting Mavericks, aren't we?
Mavs and Suns.
Yeah. So we go to 2000 now. So Vancouver has one more year of existence after this, I believe.
Yeah.
So
do we all agree that Steve Francis debacle is the reason that they leave Vancouver? The reason that Vancouver loses their team?
I think it's a big part of it. I think it's a minor part of it just because of I think Stu Jackson, not as much as Steve not going there. It's more of Stu Jackson as a GM creating the team, and then Francis not going there also, I believe, makes people in Vancouver lose interest in the team. Right, because
the lockout really hurt too. Because Vancouver was notorious for being one of those teams that were really passionate, had actually really good attendance its first few years, and then the lockout came, and they suddenly went from near the top to near the bottom, on top with a really, really poor Canadian dollar, especially in those the late 90s when it was 63 cents a dollar, really tough. And I think the owner tried to sell the team at least once or twice. He had a couple deals on, they were going to move it to St. Louis, I think.
St. Louis, Louisville. I have it all here when we get to that point after this year.
He said he lost $80 million on this deal, on this team, because especially when you have an expansion team, you're not going to win a whole lot. So who's going to want to sponsor you? And not only that, you're going to get small Canadian companies to sponsor you. You're not going to get big companies like Xerox to sponsor you, right? So suddenly that's even harder to be liquid.
And it's like Dev said. I mean, you're taking in money into your arena television deals all in Canadian dollars, yet you're paying out salaries to players in American dollars. So your income revenue is so out of whack if you're not able to fill stadiums, right?
And Devin's right. According to Wikipedia, the lockout that occurred in '98 was a turning point for the team. Attendance plummeted from the league average of 16,000 all the way down to 13, which became the third lowest in the league. Arco Bay started losing money in its operations. Also, the Canadian dollar, which was talked about. So there was an agreement in September '99 that the Grizzlies were, if the Grizzlies could not get a new arena and the Canucks won, that they would move it to St. Louis. That kind of got derailed a little bit, but the intention was to move it to St. Louis, and they backed off a little bit until later on they ended up selling it. Then they kind of put it around again, and then the other cities that were considered for relocation were Nashville, Vegas, New Orleans, St. Louis, Anaheim, San Diego, Buffalo, and Louisville.
Because I mean, like, believe it or not, maybe not believe it or not, but like the Vancouver Grizzlies were a popular team for a while.
Yeah,
people wanted to play, and especially the rivalry with Seattle and Portland, like that geographic little corridor right there, like that made for fun basketball.
And I think you can kind of go. Part of this is you look at it's also the product that's on the floor, right? If they had a more exciting lineup like we're giving them right now, this is rosters on here that would have made them a playoff team. You would have tracked in a bigger audience even after the lockout still.
Mm-hmm. But mismanagement definitely hurts it too. Like on a basketball side, like how do you? I mean, and I was thinking about this point while you guys were talking was, if you look at any of these contemporary expansion teams, with the exception of Vegas, how many of them have actually been good for most of their careers? Like you look at a team like Minnesota. Minnesota hasn't been very good. Charlotte hasn't been very good.
You talking about
like
overall or just in the NBA?
Just overall, like with a lot of sports, right? Like even at like the Atlanta Thrashers, like I know they used to be the Winnipeg Jets, but like the Atlanta Thrashers were nothing to
They were the Atlanta, then they became Winnipeg. Winnipeg used to be Phoenix, which Phoenix still doesn't work as a hockey market.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so
I don't know if Sacramento works as a basketball market. I still think the team should be moved from Sacramento personally. It's so up and down with the attendance they have, and they were also really. I don't think the Clippers work. I don't know why they continue to think the Clippers are going to work, and I know they just bought the Forum and they're going to have their own arena. At the end of the day, there's only two teams that city is going to care about, and it's the Dodgers and the Lakers, and maybe the Kings if they're good. But the Clippers can win multiple championships, and LA is never going to care about them the same way they care about the Dodgers and the Lakers.
You can't say that. If a team wins multiple championships, they will care.
It's not the same way.
Well, you're not going to have the history, but you can't like paint that with one brush and say even if they do, because we've never seen that happen. Like we've watched the Clippers.
I'm saying like you said, the Kings win, right? Ownership. I'm saying the passion of the fan base, right? Like the Kings win multiple championships, and people are like, yeah, and then the Kings suck. And like, okay, well, whatever. It's really the passion lays with the Dodgers and with the Lakers. Everything else is just kind of a fickle fan base.
By it. Yeah, no. They're not going to stick by it in down seasons.
No.
But I do feel like the Clippers are trending towards being a much more viable franchise. Like I would rather, if you were told me, can I own the Clippers or could I own the Chargers or even the Rams right now, I would much rather own the Clippers.
Yeah, I'd rather do that too. But I would also rather.
I'm not talking about LA on this podcast. God damn it!
I'd rather move the Clippers to LA anyway. So we come to this 2000 draft. To no surprise at all, before this draft happens, Stu Jackson is fired. Billy Knight comes in for 2 years. Kind of talk a little bit, Andy, about Stu Jackson. He ends up, being a really bad commissioner, but being a really good vice president of the NBA.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes down to if you're trying to big picture for the betterment of the league, that's one thing. But if you're actually trying to construct a team, clearly his knowledge and his ability to do that was just awful. I mean, if you look at guys like Stu Jackson and you compare them to the Raptors, I mean, the Raptors have their own versions of Stu Jackson, right? Like they have Glenn Grunwald and they have Isaiah Thomas and they have their own versions of guys who were like, what are you doing? Like, how are you sabotaging this team? And I think to Dev's point, if you're an expansion team and you don't manage to get yourself into a Masai type general manager, you're gonna flounder forever because you don't have a dedicated fan base. You don't have an established, core fan that you're gonna draw to. So you're constantly kind of middling in the outside of whatever is going on in that sports city. unless you're like a Nashville Predators or a Tampa Bay Lightning, where you go in and you're like, kind of the one trick pony in town. You have to get lucky and find yourself a Messiah to come in and actually build you a competent franchise.
Also, they have in their time, they average a coach a season that they're around almost. Brian Winters, 95-97, then Stu Jackson in 97, Brian Hill, 97-98, Lionel Hollins. I never knew he coached in Vancouver. I knew he coached in Memphis, but he coached both Grizzlies. 99-2000, and Sidney Lowe, 2000-2001. That's embarrassing. I don't think I've seen that much coach turnover. I can't even think of the last time I saw that much coach turnover. That's wild.
And not a single coach that you would look back on and say that was a good NBA coach. Lionel Hollins, I guess, is the
Sidney Lowe as well.
Yeah.
Well, I guess he's a good college coach. Let's go with that. He's a good college coach. So we go to the final draft they have here before the Memphis move happens. And it's a bad draft, so there was really no win on this. Kmart goes first, which is undoubtedly the best player available in this draft. They take Stromile Swift. Guys that were on the board that had name value, Darius Miles, Chris Mim, Mike Miller, Jamal Crawford, Joe Prisbilla, Keon Dooling, Turkoglu, Desmond Mason, Jamal McGlure, Mo Pete, Michael Redd.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a bad draft.
Take your pick. Who cares? Well, Michael Redd was pretty good, but that's kind of like rose-tinted glasses with those Bucks teams.
Right. Stroh was not terrible. Again, it's a guy that was okay,
Yes, he was.
but he got hurt.
Terrible.
He got hurt. That's the problem again. He got hurt. Not worth going to the second overall
Well,
pick.
we're not taking Darius Miles, whatever we do. So
I know.
as much as it'd be fun, you can sell a couple jerseys. It was kind of like an NBA crazy man.
Do you just take Mike Miller here?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
And is Mike Miller? So Mike Miller is your sixth man then?
You're taking Mike Miller or Michael Redd, really?
Yeah, and they're both six men.
Yeah. Who would you rather have, Mike Miller or Michael Redd?
I mean, if I was LeBron, the answer is obvious.
Yeah. By the way, too, is Michael Redd the best player in this draft over Kmart, or is Kmart still the best player in this draft?
Kmart's the best player in this draft.
Michael Redd is the second best player in this draft?
Mike Miller?
Probably.
And then Mike Miller and then Jamal Crawford. Those are the four best players, right?
Q Rich.
Hey, what year was
Q Rich is in this too, by the way, yeah.
What year was Shane Battier?
He's after this.
Oh, okay. It's like, damn, that would have been a nice.
He's 2 years after this, I think, because then the Grizzlies start drafting good because they get Powell and they get Battier.
2001. So we just missed him.
Yeah. So what? We could go with Marcus Fizer.
Oh God. What season is this? So what is this? The 99 2000 season? Is that what we're looking at?
2001 season.
Okay. Let's take a look.
Are you going to ask who the NBA champion was at this time? Because I think I know.
Nope. Don't know, don't care, but all I know is Allen Iverson stepped over Tyronn Lue.
Cool story. One game. Great.
It was a cool story.
Against it was like David versus Goliath, man. It was literally David versus Goliath, especially Shaq. Like, come on, man. Give him a bone.
Then Goliath got swatted.
I'm not talking about LA anymore. So
anyway, so who would you go? We're gonna go with Mike Miller or Michael Redd here.
Mike Miller.
Yeah, Mike Miller. So there you go. So the potential draft that we had for them, the draft that the Grizzlies had in their small time in Vancouver, they had Bryant Reeves, Sharif Abdul-Rahim, Antonio Daniels, Mike Bibby, Steve Francis, which was really Michael Dickerson from the 98 draft. That's the asset that they ended up getting for that. And then Stromile Swift. And then we picked Mike Miller. And instead, what we had the potential that they could have ended up with was Mike Finley, Steve Nash, Tracy McGrady, Dirk Nowitzki, Sean Marion, and Mike Miller.
Literally Dallas.
Like, that is an NBA championship level team. That is
especially after the millennium, when you're looking at like 2000, let's say 2002 to 2005, absolute studs. They're all studs.
that's a team that could compete with the Spurs, compete with the Lakers, and any other powerhouses in the West at that time very easily.
Mm-hmm.
Do we go to 2001, or we're just going to call it a wrap? But that's what the Grizzlies are, right?
That's what the Grizzlies are.
Then after that, the next year they get Pau Gasol. Then the year after that, then they get Shane Battier. Do they get Shane Battier? Yeah. Oh, they take Drew Gooden the year after that. So some bad drafting still to come for them when Amari Stoudemire was on the board. Where was Shane Battier? Do they have 2 picks in 2002? Maybe? Or am I crazy?
Does he get traded there?
Shane Battier. Yeah, no, the Grizzlies have 2 picks. Atlanta trades them the rights there. So they get Shane Battier and Pau Gasol together in that next draft. The year after Vancouver. The same draft. They get both players. And probably the 2 best players in that draft, other than Joe Johnson, looking back at it, no, never mind.
Oh, I doubt it.
In that draft. And Gilbert's in that draft. But you have 2 of the better players in there. One of the better defensive players, Tyson Chandler's in that draft. So yeah, the next year, just so hypothetical, let's say they stay in Vancouver for that year and they end up getting Pau and they get Battier around some of the pieces that they have. They still have Stroh and all that at this point, right? How is that? That team's still not a bad team all of a sudden. You have Pau, you have Sharif, you have Mike Bibby with Shane Battier. That's a little bit of a frisky team. And Michael Dickerson.
That's like
the problem is you have a whole team is always hurt. Like everybody is hurt constantly.
Well, I didn't include the players that weren't hurt other than Michael Dickerson. Brian Reeves, I'm assuming, is at this point.
And you got team attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Team attitude a little bit for sure. So I mean, I think when they click, they click really, really, really well, and when they don't, they hate each other. It's a lot like LeBron James teams.
Mm-hmm. Yep, good point. So there you go. There are the Grizzlies drafts, and it just sucks. And you see that next one, and then look, Memphis does really good with that draft. But then the next one is they pick Drew Gooden, who was okay to average as an NBA player. And then the next year in 2003, they could have had Carmelo, they could have had Bosh, they could have had Wade, but they traded that pick for Otis Thorpe. And Memphis ends up having to give that pick to Detroit unless it was the first pick overall. Really quickly, let's say that Memphis pick becomes the first pick overall. Is that like the biggest thing that ever haunts Vancouver fans, even more than the team leaving?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So the 2003 pick, it was traded originally for Otis Thorpe, right, to Detroit. And it was first overall protected in 2003. It ends up going second, which Detroit uses, obviously, to draft Darko. Mm-hmm. If that Grizzly pick ends up going 1, they're not in Vancouver anymore, they're in Memphis. But if that pick goes number 1 and the Grizzlies pick LeBron, is that a bigger hurt to Vancouver Grizzly fans than even leaving Vancouver?
Oh, God, yeah. It's not even – that would twist the knife 3 or 4 times over.
Do you think they even look that far ahead? Like, I still think Steve Francis is still the biggest dagger because they know everything after him is
but you're looking at your team left, and you're getting one of the greatest player. You're getting the biggest hype player in the history of the draft at that point since Shaq, and he's going to Memphis now after they just left your franchise.
Does he go? Does he actually even go? If they were still in Vancouver, would he even play in Vancouver?
LeBron, yeah, of course he would have.
For 3 years and then left?
Well, he wouldn't have 3. He would have had to do 6 because that's kind of how the rookie scale goes. Within that point, he would have done what he did with the Cavs. Still, yeah, he still would have done what he done with the Cavs. But still, you're looking at the potential here that Vancouver fans are like, man, our team left. This sucks. 2 years passed by. Oh, right, we traded that pick for Otis Thorpe. Oh, it's the first overall. Because I remember some Vancouver Grizzly fans that I was still friends with and watching that draft lottery and be like, just don't be the first pick. Please don't. And when it went to Detroit at 2, they're like, fine, that's cool. That was the last torture piece of being a Vancouver Grizzly fan. If that pick would have gone to number 1 still and would have landed them LeBron. That, like Devin said, that would have just twisted the knife. It's like Seattle fans, right? A little bit different. Of they had to spend all those years watching KD, and then the extra insult being a Seattle fan of watching Harden and watching Ross and Ibaka all those years.
Yeah.
Knowing they could have been there, because Russell's drafted as a Sonic too, and so was Ibaka.
Could you imagine the state of Canadian basketball if you would have had prime time Vince, T-Mac in Toronto and LeBron in Vancouver?
Oh, it'd be a game changer.
I mean, Canadian basketball is the dominant force in a U.S. sport.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're already doing pretty well as it is, but you're right, though.
Imagine that team, too. You have a potential starting lineup on that Grizzlies team at that point, if everything kind of stays the way that it does, of Pau Gasol, Stromile Swift, not even Stromile Swift at that point, he's injured. You have Drew Gooden, who's fine. You have LeBron James, Shane Battier, and you have J-Dub at that point because he's traded for Mike Bibby. That's a pretty good starting lineup, and that's a pretty good starting lineup for a rookie LeBron to come into.
Well, you have a whole team that's willing to play defense around him at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he certainly never had that in those early years in Cleveland.
Well, and you get the defender in Battier that can also shoot threes. You get a great big and Powell that you can use. He would be able to use Gooden a lot better. We saw how he could use Gooden in Cleveland. Maybe you have Stroh coming off the bench. Maybe you have Sharif coming off the bench at that point. It could be an entirely different team, and it's an interesting what if they could have had. And even if you kind of look at it, if they didn't trade for Otis Thorpe at that pick, I think that's almost worse, right? If you didn't trade for Otis Thorpe, you're like, oh, we could have had Melo or Bosch or Wade, but the bigger one is obviously there. To kind of wrap up this Vancouver thing, I guess what's the lasting memory of Vancouver? I'll go with you first, Dev.
Well, considering I was still learning how to tie my shoes when Vancouver was around, I would probably say the jersey and the logo.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really aged nice. Memphis is wearing them a whole bunch of times this year, and they just fit so well with our current aesthetic. It's always been kind of a logo. Like, even when it was quote-unquote ugly, I think people still really respected it.
Mm-hmm.
Like the purple dinos, right? Kind of like the purple dinosaur uniforms. Like, everybody still loves those.
Mm-hmm. Andy, so I guess it's kind of a combination of the lasting of, it started off great. The draft and the transactions really hurt it. And Stu Jackson just really the center of just terrible management of a team.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think if you don't have Stu Jackson there and you have better drafting and all of that, I think Orca survives the lockout, survives the down dollar. Like,
they never get their Vince, right?
They
never get their Vince. If Vince doesn't go to the Raptors, let's say they even keep Twan, and I love Antoine Jameson. He's probably my favorite Tar Heel of all time. I don't know if Antoine can if Vince doesn't go there, you could potentially look at the Raptors going, because there was sale talks about the Raptors at one point too, right? Of like, is this even going to work in Canada basketball? Vince kind of saved the Raptors.
I mean, the saving grace for the Raptors has always been their ownership groups being part of MLSE meant that you were always going to be, you were going to have deep pockets behind you all the time.
Right.
So the situation in terms of ownership was always going to be different in Toronto. Just throw it out there. Does anybody think that there's a chance that Vancouver gets a team again?
No.
No, because there's no expansion. Silver's been very clear on that. The only way you're going to get it is if a team moves.
If expansion was to happen, does anybody think that a team back in Vancouver is on the table for the NBA?
I think it's possible, but Seattle and Vegas are the two markets you're looking at first.
Right.
And even then, you're looking at, like, let's go down the line a little bit. Like, you're looking at Louisville or St. Louis would be another great option because it's historically important to the NBA. So it'd be
Nashville.
down the line.
I know Silver has mentioned he regrets how Vancouver happened, and David Stern said it's his biggest regret of what happened in Vancouver. It was one of his biggest regrets that it didn't work out in Vancouver. And one of the last things David Stern was saying before he unfortunately passed was he would love to get it back to Vancouver because he liked what they had there, and he was really upset they didn't make it work. But obviously Seattle is number one on top of the chain for an NBA team returning to, and then obviously with now the NHL in Vegas and NFL getting ready for Vegas and possibly the Oakland A's moving to Vegas if everything continues to go wrong in Oakland. And maybe, baseball would maybe be looking to go there as well. Vegas seems like the next likely spot now that the Golden Knights kind of set the bar that you can have a franchise in Vegas. But Vancouver's one of the locations that they would like to reconsider down the road.
I think too, like like as Dev said earlier, the perception of Canada and that is starting to slowly change. You still hear the Lou Williams of the world say, well, it's weird to go up there because all the channels are on, like, I don't know what channel ESPN is on or whatever, but I think the perception is changing in terms of Toronto being a city that somebody from the US is willing to go to, willing to live in, and can have a good existence in a Canadian city.
Absolutely. It's very sad to see Vancouver gone. It'd be really nice, especially we're out here in Alberta. It'd be nice to be able to drive to a game if we wanted to, but maybe one day they'll rise. But I think the unfortunate thing is that Adam's been very clear that there is no interest in expansion at this point. So it'd have to be a franchise moving, and all the franchises that we thought moving have kind of been closed. Sacramento, that book is closed, and now New Orleans, that book is closed too. So I don't know who the NBA team could be that would be moving on next. Every other team seems pretty healthy now.
Agreed.
Yeah, there's not many teams losing money when they're all worth at least $1 billion, right? So
yeah, and yeah, maybe the pandemic changes that for some teams. I don't know. That'll be something that we figure out down the road. But I mean, there's also going to be other cities that are losing money and whatnot. It's going to be a different story to go down. But gentlemen, thanks for doing this. It was a fun road to kind of go back down to Vancouver and refigure things out. Again, the lineup that we had, that potential of the players they could have drafted was Michael Finley, Steve Nash, Tracy McGrady, Dirk Nowitzki, Sean Marion, and Mike Miller for the Grizzlies before they inevitably moved to Memphis and then have a really good draft. It's almost cruel. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And until next time, cheers.
This was actually kind of fun.
Enjoy the day, people.